Welcome to The Space Between, a podcast about seeking and finding alignment. I'm your host, Josh Scott, and I'm grateful that you've joined me for another conversation. Hey everybody, welcome to this episode of The Space Between. I am really excited today for my guest. She's somebody who probably doesn't need a lot of introduction, but I'm going to give you one and then we're going to jump right into it. I'm really honored to have Diana Butler Bass with me today. Diana is an award-winning author of 9 books on American religion. She holds a PhD in religious studies from Duke University. She's taught at the college and graduate level and is currently an independent scholar. She lives in Alexandria, Virginia with her husband, daughter, and dog, and she recently has released a book, which we'll talk about a bit later, called Grateful, The Transformative Power of Giving Thanks. Diana, welcome.
Well, thanks for having me, Josh. It's good to be here with you.
So appreciate you being part of this discussion this morning. One of the things we do on The Space Between is we're just trying to figure out and hear stories. I put it to somebody like this the other day, sort of the art of testimony, like the testimony thing that used to happen in church services a lot.
That's great.
And so what does it look like to talk about our own stories of seeking alignment between our head and our heart? So I guess I would want to begin. You're a nationally recognized scholar. You're a prolific author. You're brilliant on Twitter, by the way. Absolutely brilliant. I just saw an op-ed you wrote that was out yesterday or today. And so, but I'm guessing that there's been a journey to get there. Would you mind telling us a bit about your journey?
Oh, gosh. I just turned 59, so there's a lot of decades now to cover when somebody asks me about my journey. But I think that the sort of simplest explanation is I've always been a person who was associated with church and faith. I was born into a Methodist church that my great-grandparents helped to found, and that my parents were very active in, or my mother particularly, when I was little. So church has always been a really important part of my life. And whenever I would think about, who I was and what I was called to do in the world, it was always a question of calling and of theology and of vocation. I remember when I was really small, I would ask my mom questions like, why are we here? Mm-hmm. And my mom would say, to serve other people. And that was the way that I was raised, with this idea that we're put here on this earth to create goodness and to take care of other people. And sometimes I'd say to her, well, why are all those other people here? Which shows I had sort of a bend, bend towards theology, at least at a young age. I was pretty precocious philosophically.
Saying about growing up Methodist, one of the things I grew up Free Will Baptist and then Southern Baptist. And one of the things I always tell my Methodist friends when we're in conversation is you missed out on some of the trauma, because most of my Methodist friends never watched like the Thief in the Night movies or anything like that. So I just imagine you have always slept better than I did as a young person.
Yeah, Methodism, especially when I was growing up in the 1950s, in 60s. I was born in 59, so I was mostly I was baptized in 59 and mostly was in church, as a little girl in the 1960s. And it certainly wasn't perfect. And the main sort of shortfalls that we had was we were having huge arguments about social justice when I was a little kid. About civil rights movement and about Vietnam. Those were the conversations that were happening most often in my church. So it was not perfect. And there were a lot of people who were very racist. And there were a lot of people who were, gung-ho, America can do no wrong types. But at the same time, there was a way in which Methodism was, I think, in the mid part of the 20th century, a fairly gentle Protestant tradition. Mm-hmm. And that is, it had a lot of room for conversation. And we had some real heroes. I mean, a lot of people in the church eventually really did step up on those super important issues. White people, the Black people were always there. At the front of those issues. But, eventually white people heard that. And I was part of a family where my mother was pretty active and supportive of Dr. King and the civil rights movement. And that was all part of our lives, and that was wrapped up in my mom's comment is we're here to help other people. We're here to create a better world. And she was a pretty admirable person in that way. And so her Methodism was always that of loving God and loving our neighbor as ourselves. And that became the real framework of my Christian life. A thief in the night came later. Because when my parents moved, I grew up in Maryland, which is actually called the cradle, that whole area of geography is called the cradle of American Methodism.
Really?
Yeah, it's one of the most historic places in the history of Methodism. It's where the Methodist Church was founded in Baltimore. And
I was just in Maryland for the first time last year. I had a speaking engagement there, and it was in like farm country.
It's beautiful, isn't it?
It's absolutely stunning. I couldn't get over it. It actually looks a little like Kentucky.
Yeah, it's a surprisingly rural state for a place that's in the middle of the East Coast, jammed between Washington, D.C. and Philadelphia.
Yeah.
But it is it's a nice place. And the idea of it being the cradle of Methodism kind of fits, as a religion in Maryland in certain kinds of ways. So anyway, that was our tradition. But my parents moved from there to Arizona in 1972. And you were asking me about testimony. It was that move that really uprooted not only my family geographically, but also emotionally and spiritually. And while I got confirmed in the Methodist Church in Arizona in 74, my parents just stopped going to church. And I was like lost. It was like, well, what do I do now? So I started going to church with friends, and I wound up in a Bible church with a whole bunch of pastors from Dallas Theological Seminary. So I did see A Thief in the Night.
You didn't escape it.
I did not escape it. And I also read Hal Lindsey and sat
Late
in
Great Planet Earth.
Yep, Late Great Planet Earth. And there was another one too that was also pretty popular. I can't remember what that one was called, but there were two of them that were huge bestsellers in the mid 70s. And so I read those books and, saw plenty of apocalyptic television and went to Billy Graham rallies. So I did all that stuff. But I chose it, for a certain period of my life. It was not the world I was born into.
Yeah.
And my parents were pretty confused by it, as a matter of fact. They just thought it was some sort of cult. And which some people do say that is kind of the case. And so later on, so I was born Methodist, became an evangelical, and then went to an evangelical college in California. And when I was there, I just fell in love with the Episcopal Church. And for a long time was trying to blend the beauty and the tradition and the ritual of the Episcopal Church with being an evangelical. And eventually that proved an unstable combination, to say the least. And so I wound up being an Episcopalian. So that's my religious journey. But the interesting part about the vocational thing is that I always did want to do good. For a while, I wanted to be a teacher, then a missionary, and then a college professor. And I actually wound up being a college professor, and then I got fired. And that was from my very first ever job. I was teaching theology and church history at the very same college where I had been a student 10 years earlier. And when I got back as a professor, they didn't like me. They liked me better as a student when I was compliant. But they sure did not like, especially in 1991, having the first ever woman teaching in their religious studies department. And I was idealistic, and I was a feminist, and I really thought that they had brought me there to say what I truly believed and to teach the students how to think for themselves in really provocative and interesting ways. and to model that as a Christian. And then I found out that that's not what they wanted me to do. And so I got fired. And of course, they like to say that they did not fire me. They like to say, we did not renew your contract. And so,
Yeah.
So I became who I am by getting fired from the job I thought I was supposed to have.
Interesting.
Yeah. So sometimes what I think the main thing that I have learned in my life is that sometimes the thing that we dream of more than anything else, and we might think we achieve it for a time, if we ever lose that thing, or if that thing eludes us, it only means that there's a different pathway open for us.
Yeah. Wow. When I was, I guess, early 20s, right out of college, I didn't want to be a pastor at first. My grandfather was a pastor. And so anyway, I ended up wanting to do it. And then I spent over a year not doing anything in church, and because I'd been preaching and all that. And I just spent a year sort of out in the desert. Not literally, I was in Nashville, but that sense of, gosh, the thing I'm hoping for isn't happening. Like that's a load to carry sometimes. And yet I think you're right. It does open us up to something else, perhaps even something better than we ever would have imagined.
Yeah, I was watching this past weekend the new Netflix movie called Come Sunday, which is about Carlton Pearson,
Yeah.
who used to be a bishop in an African-American Pentecostal denomination. And his journey, of course, is that he was very successful. He was mentored by Oral Roberts, and he had this huge church. And what happened was he began to believe in universal salvation, is that salvation is not just for the few, and that the atoning work of Christ on the cross opens the path of healing up for the whole of the world. And so the movie depicts his struggle as he's reading the Bible, and he sees this thread that he's never seen before. And he begins to preach on it. And of course, what happens is he loses most of his friends, all of the people who were his colleagues turn on him. They reject him. They kick him out. Well over 2/3 of the people in his church leave. And so there he goes from the pinnacle of success to being an absolute, what appears to be, failure. Mm-hmm. And he doesn't know how. His wife has to get a secretarial job, after she's been the first lady of this huge Pentecostal church. And he has little kids. And the whole thing is really, really hard because it's about a man whose dream crashes because he follows his conscience. And then, not to spoil the movie, but in the last scene, there's this powerful resolution where a different path opens for him. And it is so unexpected and so beautiful that I was watching the movie and I was weeping. Because that's a story that so many of us can resonate. We can resonate with that story. And it certainly was my story in so many ways. And it's actually a beautiful story to see depicted in literature and in a form, like a film.
In some ways, that's the heart of the Christian narrative, right? Which is this, you experience defeat and death, but on the other side, there's new life waiting.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly the Holy Week story. And I have sometimes, when I've been doing presentations, I talk about narrative arcs. That a narrative arc is the shape of a story and the direction of a story. And I think that a lot of Christian communities like what I call positive narrative arcs. And that is, you begin with a problem or a question. And then throughout the story, the writer builds upward, so you're getting insight and evidence, etc. And then all of a sudden the story reaches a peak and then it slides out to its resolution. So it's almost like it's almost like going on a hiking trip, until you see up at the top of the mountain and then you come down. And there's a lot of books that are written like that. I read a lot of them when I was a little girl.